My name is Daniel Reeves and I'm 38 years old. 6 years ago, my brother told everyone I had abandoned our dying father to chase money in New York City. He said I left. He said I chose my career over family. He said I wasn't there when Dad took his last breath. Every word was a lie. I was there. I was the only one there. But by the time the funeral was over, I had lost my mother, my extended family, and the business my father had spent 30 years building. Then last spring, my brother's company collapsed. The bank called in his loans. His partners walked away. His employees hadn't been paid in 3 months. There was one man in the country who could restructure a business like his and save what was left. He didn't know that man was me. Let me take you back to the beginning. To a Tuesday morning in October, in a small town called Mill Haven, Pennsylvania. Population 12,000. The kind of town where everybody knows your father's name and your grandfather's name and what your family stands for. Our family stood for Reeves Hardware and Supply. My father, Gordon Reeves, built it from a single storefront on Main Street in 1987. By the time I was 10 years old, it had expanded to 3 locations across 2 counties. By the time I was in high school, it employed 62 people. Half of Mill Haven had a story about my father. He'd extended credit to families during hard times. He'd hired veterans nobody else would. He'd donated lumber and materials after the flood of 2003 wiped out the lower neighborhoods. Gordon Reeves was the kind of man who made a town feel like it had a spine. I am his younger son. My brother, Caleb, is 4 years older. He came out of childhood the way some people come out of a factory, built for a specific purpose, shaped for a specific role. He was loud where I was quiet. He was at every town event, every church function, every school board meeting my father attended. He shook hands the way Dad shook hands. He laughed the way Dad laughed. From the time he was 16, everyone in Mill Haven said the same thing. That Caleb Reeves, he's just like his father. Nobody said that about me. I was the one at the kitchen table with a calculator and a spreadsheet, pulling apart the hardware store's quarterly numbers at age 15 because I wanted to understand why the second location wasn't performing. I was the one who stayed up until 2 in the morning reading about inventory management and supply chain logistics because I found it genuinely fascinating. Dad noticed. He never said much, but he noticed. When I was 17, he sat across from me at that same kitchen table and slid a yellow notepad across the surface. He'd written 3 words on it. In his handwriting, careful and deliberate, the way he did everything. You see clearly. I kept that notepad. I still have it. It's in my desk drawer in New York, next to a photo of him. I went to Penn State for finance. Then to NYU for my MBA. Then I took a position at a restructuring firm in Manhattan. Corporate turnarounds. Businesses in crisis. I had a gift for it, the same gift I'd had at 15 with a spreadsheet. I could look at something that was failing and see exactly where the rot had started and exactly how to stop it. Caleb stayed in Mill Haven. Took a management role at the store. Learned the operations side directly from Dad. It made sense. It seemed right. I was building expertise I could eventually bring home. Dad and I talked about it once on the phone. Give me 10 years, I told him. I'll come back knowing things that can take this business to the next level. He laughed. His real laugh. Not the performing one. The quiet one. Just don't forget where home is, Danny. I didn't. Dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in January of my 31st year. Stage 3. Aggressive. The oncologist in Pittsburgh was direct. Treatment could slow it. It would not stop it. I flew home the weekend after his diagnosis. Sat with him and Mom in the living room of the house I grew up in. The same carpet, the same curtains, the same clock on the mantel that always ran 7 minutes fast. Dad looked smaller than I remembered. That's the thing nobody warns you about. The first time you see a strong man diminished by illness, the wrongness of it is physical. It hits you in the stomach. We talked for 3 hours. About the business. About the family. About what mattered. At the end of the night, he held my hand and said, I need you here, Danny. Not in 10 years. Now. I flew back to New York, negotiated a remote arrangement with my firm, and was back in Mill Haven within 3 weeks. I set up an office in the spare bedroom of Dad's house and began managing his care alongside my consulting work. Caleb was there, too, in the way Caleb was always there. Present. Visible. Running the store, coming home for dinners, sitting with Dad in the evenings. Mom loved having him close. The house felt full. What I didn't understand then, because I wasn't looking for it, was what Caleb was doing when the rest of us weren't watching. For 11 months, I coordinated everything. I managed Dad's medical appointments, researched his treatment options, communicated with the oncology team in Pittsburgh and a specialist I found in Philadelphia who had experience with his specific tumor profile. I drove him to chemotherapy 43 times. I know the number because I kept a log, the same way I kept records of everything, because that's how my mind works and because I understood, even then, that documentation was a form of love. On the evenings when the nausea from treatment left him unable to sleep, I sat in the chair beside his bed and we talked. About his childhood, his parents, the early days of the store, the years before Caleb and I were born. He told me stories I'd never heard. About mistakes he'd made. About the things he wished he'd done differently. About us. One night in September, about 2 months before he died, he said something I've turned over in my mind 1,000 times since. He said, "I know I made it easy for people to misread you, Danny. I should have been louder about what I saw." I told him it didn't matter. He shook his head. "That's not true," he said. "It matters. And you're going to need to remember I said it." I didn't know what he meant. Not then. Dad died on a Thursday in November. Early morning, still dark outside, the kind of quiet that only exists in small towns at 4 in the morning. I was in the room. Mom was on his other side. Caleb had gone home to sleep at midnight, said he'd be back by 6. He wasn't back by 6. Dad was gone by 4:47. I held my mother's hand while she cried. I called the hospice nurse. I called Caleb. I handled every phone call that needed to be made in the hours that followed, because someone had to, and I was the one in the room. The funeral was 5 days later. 200 people came. Millhaven turning out for Gordon Reeves the way Millhaven does for people who mattered. Long lines in the cold. Stories shared in the parking lot afterward. A reception at the fire hall with casseroles and coleslaw and that specific grief food that small towns have perfected over generations. I moved through it in a kind of practiced numbness. Speaking when spoken to. Accepting condolences. Watching my mother. I didn't notice, not at first, what was happening in the conversations I wasn't part of. Caleb worked the room the way he'd always worked rooms. Handshakes and embraces and that performative grief that reads as strength to people who don't know the difference between strength and theater. He told stories about Dad. He said all the right things. He also said other things. I found out gradually, over the 2 weeks following the funeral, as various people said various things that didn't quite align with my experience of the previous 11 months. My father's oldest friend, Ray Connor, stopped me outside the hardware store and said, "I'm glad you came back for the end, at least." I looked at him. "Ray, I've been here for almost a year." He looked confused. "Caleb said you flew in when it got bad. Last few weeks." A cousin on my mother's side told me she'd heard I'd been too busy with New York to help with the caregiving. A woman from my parents' church told my mother she was glad Caleb had been there to handle everything. I called my mother that evening. Told her what I was hearing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Caleb told us you were barely present. That you were taking calls all day for work. That he was the one managing things." I sat down. I felt the floor shift in the way it shifts when something you trusted turns out to have been hollow. "Mom," I said. "I drove Dad to 43 chemotherapy appointments. I have the dates. I have the receipts. I coordinated his entire care team." Another silence. "Caleb said you needed to believe that. He said you have trouble accepting when you're not the most important person in the room." I understood then. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't miscommunication. This was architecture. What Caleb had built was elegant in the way that only truly patient deception can be. He had spent 11 months, while I drove and researched and coordinated and sat in hospital chairs at 3 in the morning, planting seeds. Small comments. Careful omissions. Expressions of concern framed as loyalty. He'd told my mother I was doing his best but struggling to be present. He'd told our relatives I meant well but had trouble disconnecting from work. He'd told the family friend who handled my father's estate planning that I had made clear I wasn't planning to stay in Millhaven long term. He hadn't needed to say anything dramatic. He just needed to tilt the frame slightly, consistently, for long enough that everyone's perception of me had drifted without their realizing it. And then, when Dad died, when Caleb was the one who got his name on the operating agreement of Reeves Hardware as sole inheritor of the management rights, the transition felt natural to everyone who'd been watching through the frame he'd built. I contested it, hired a lawyer, presented documentation. The care logs, the medical receipts, the communications with the oncology team, everything I'd kept because that's how I'm built. The lawyer reviewed it all. Then he told me the uncomfortable truth. What Caleb had done was unethical. It was not, in the legal sense he could fight, actionable. Dad's estate documents were legitimate. Dad had signed them during a period of documented competency. Whatever conversations Caleb had in Dad's ear during those months, we couldn't prove coercion. My mother believed Caleb. My aunts and uncles believed Caleb. The family friend who'd written the documents believed Caleb. I had documents and receipts and a yellow notepad with 3 words in my father's handwriting. They had a story about me that had been told, quietly and consistently, for 11 months. Stories beat documents in the court of family opinion. I've never forgotten that. I went back to New York. The night before I left, I sat in the parking lot of the hardware store for an hour. Looked at the sign with my family name on it. Thought about the 14-year-old version of myself who had sat at a kitchen table pulling apart quarterly numbers just because he loved understanding how things worked. Then I drove away. I told myself I wouldn't look back. I was wrong. Not about leaving. About the looking back. You always look back. The question is what you're looking for when you do. For 6 years, I built something. Not out of spite. I want to be clear about that because the distinction matters to me. I rebuilt my career in New York out of genuine love for the work, the same love I'd had at 15, the same clarity my father had named on that yellow notepad. You see clearly. I saw clearly. Within 2 years of returning to the city, I had made partner at my firm. Within 4, I was leading the division. Within 6, I was the person that other restructuring firms called when they encountered something they couldn't handle. I was not thinking about Millhaven. I was not planning anything. I had closed that chapter with the kind of deliberate finality that takes real effort to maintain. I had a good life. A serious relationship with a woman named Claire who was a litigation attorney and the most intellectually honest person I'd ever met. An apartment in Brooklyn with a porch that got good light in the mornings. A team at work I was genuinely proud of. I had Maggie, my mentor, a 60-year-old veteran of corporate finance who had a gift for seeing around corners and who, more than once, told me that my greatest professional asset was my refusal to let emotion cloud my analysis. I did not tell Maggie about Millhaven for 3 years. When I finally did, over a dinner after a long case, she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said only this. The truth has a long memory and a longer reach. Don't do anything. Just keep working. I took that advice. The call came on a Wednesday in March. Not from Caleb. From a business broker in Pittsburgh named Gerald Foss who had worked with my father 20 years earlier and who tracked me down through the firm's main number. He told me that Reeves Hardware and Supply was in serious trouble. Over the previous 3 years, Caleb had expanded aggressively. 3 new locations, a fleet of delivery vehicles, a warehouse he'd built on borrowed money using the original 3 stores as collateral. He'd taken the brand my father spent 30 years building and leveraged every inch of it to fund growth that the underlying business couldn't support. His primary lender had called the loans. He had 60 days to find a restructuring solution or the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings on all 3 original properties. 62 employees were at risk. The Reeves name, the one my father had built into something that meant something in 2 counties, would effectively cease to exist. Gerald told me all of this. Then he said, I'm calling you because I know what you do, and because I knew your father, and because I think if anyone can save what's left of what Gordon built, it's you. And I think Caleb knows that too, which is why he hasn't called you himself. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after we hung up. Claire was in the other room. I could hear her moving around the kitchen. Hippo, our 3-year-old retriever, was asleep at my feet. Normal evening. Normal life. I thought about what Maggie had said. The truth has a long memory and a longer reach. I thought about 62 people in Millhaven who had worked for my father, and who were now working for my brother, and who had nothing to do with what had happened between us. I thought about the sign with my family name on it. Then I called Gerald back. Set up the meeting, I said. But I'm coming in as myself. No intermediary. No softening. Caleb knows who I am and what I do. If he wants my help, he asks me directly. The meeting was at the original store, after hours. I drove up from the city on a Thursday, arrived at 6 in the evening. The parking lot was empty. The lights inside were still on. I stood at the door for a moment and read the sign the same way I'd read it the night I left. Reeves Hardware and Supply. Established 1987. I walked in. Caleb was standing at the counter. 42 years old. He looked like someone who hadn't slept well in months, which I suspected was accurate. The confidence that had always been his primary texture was still there, but it was thinner. Like paint on wood that started to warp. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said anything for about 5 seconds. Then he said, "I wasn't sure you'd come." I said, "I wasn't sure I would either. But here I am." He didn't apologize. I hadn't expected him to. Caleb is not built for direct apology. He would circle it, I knew, the way he circled everything, with implication and atmosphere. He would let his evident desperation stand in for contrition. He would hope I would receive it as such. I was not going to receive it as such. "Before we talk about the business," I said, "I need to say something." He nodded. "I know what you did. With Mom, with the relatives, with the estate. I know how you built it, and I know how long you spent building it. I'm not here because I've forgiven you. I'm not here because I think this is going to fix anything between us." He looked at the floor. "I'm here because 62 people who worked for Dad could lose their jobs. And because Dad spent 30 years building something that meant something. And because I am actually good at this, and if there's a version of this where those things survive, I need to try to find it. That's the only reason I'm in this room." He looked up. His jaw was tight. "Understood. Good," I said. "Now show me everything." He showed me everything. 3 hours at the counter with the financial records spread between us. Loan documents, lease agreements, inventory reports, cash flow statements. I went through all of it with the same methodical attention I brought to every case. The situation was bad. I'd been in worse. The structure Caleb had built was over-leveraged and under-optimized, but the original 3 stores were still fundamentally sound. The brand still had equity. The relationships with suppliers were intact. The staff, most of whom had been there for years, knew what they were doing. The new locations were the problem. 2 of the 3 were underperforming and actively draining capital. The warehouse was an unnecessary expense at the current revenue level. I worked until midnight. Then I drove to the motel on Route 30 that I'd stayed at 20 years ago during a summer job. Same sign. Same ice machine in the outdoor corridor. In the morning, I called Claire. Told her it would be another 2 days. She said, "Is it what you thought?" I said, "It's fixable." She knew what that meant. Over the following 6 weeks, I put together a restructuring plan. Negotiate a loan modification with the primary lender, which I did, because I had relationships in that world that Caleb did not. Close the 2 underperforming new locations in an orderly way, which preserved the staff from those locations for transfers to the original stores. Renegotiate the warehouse lease into a sublease arrangement that eliminated the monthly loss. Implement an inventory optimization system that the original stores had needed for years but never gotten. I billed my standard rate. Every hour documented. Every decision explained in writing. I was not doing this for free. That mattered to me. Not because of the money, but because I was not going to allow what I was doing to be interpreted as sentiment. This was professional. This was the same work I did for anyone who came to me. Caleb signed off on every piece of it. He didn't fight me on anything. That was new. I think losing things, real things, things your father built, does something to a person's capacity for argument. I think Caleb spent those 6 weeks understanding, for the first time, what it actually costs to dismantle trust. Not the strategic cost, he'd always understood strategy. The weight of it. The way it stays in your body. On the last day, after the final documents were signed and the restructuring plan was officially in place, I was packing up the spare office I'd been using at the back of the original store. My father's old office, actually. Same desk. Different chair. Caleb knocked on the open door. I kept organizing papers. He came in and sat down across from me in the chair that used to be the customer chair. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I told Mom you were barely there. When Dad was sick. I stopped moving. I told the whole family." His voice was flat. Not emotional, just factual, the way someone talks when they've decided to be done with something. "I told them for months. Started before you even came back, honestly. Just small things. Then when you were here, I kept going. I wanted them to see what I saw every day, which was you coming in and being better at the things that mattered most, and I didn't know how to live with that." I looked at him. He looked like Dad. He'd always looked more like Dad than I did. The irony of that had never fully stopped being painful. "I knew you kept records," he said. "Logs, receipts, everything. I counted on nobody asking to see them." I sat down. "Why are you telling me this now?" He thought about it. Genuinely, it seemed. "Because I almost lost the one thing Dad actually left behind. And you came back and saved it. And I'm sitting in the room where he used to sit, and I can't keep carrying this. I'm tired of it." I nodded slowly. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," I said. "It's not fine. You told our mother I was absent when she lost her husband. You took the business. You built a story about me that my whole family believed for 6 years." I paused. "That's not something I'm going to fold into forgiveness on a Thursday afternoon." "I know," he said. "But I also didn't come back here to punish you. I came back for the same reason I just told you I did. And I meant it." He nodded. "You need to tell Mom the truth," I said. "Not a version of it. Not the version where you frame yourself well. The actual truth. The same way I just said it to you." He was quiet for a moment. "She's not going to take it well." "No," I said. "She's not. Will you be there when I tell her?" I thought about that. The 2-year-old version of me, the one who sat at that kitchen table doing math nobody asked him to do. The 11-month version who drove to Pittsburgh 43 times. The one who sat in a parking lot reading a sign with his family name on it. "Yes," I said. "I'll be there." We told her on a Saturday. Mom's kitchen. The same table. The same clock on the wall, still running 7 minutes fast. Caleb talked for 40 minutes without stopping. He told her everything. The early comments. The strategic framing. The estate documents. The years of maintenance. He didn't dress it up. He didn't reach for context or explanation. He just told the truth, flat and sequential, the way I'd asked him to. Mom listened without speaking. When he finished, the kitchen was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator running. She looked at me. "You drove him to chemotherapy 43 times, she said. "Yes." "I didn't know." "I know you didn't." She pressed both hands flat on the table. Stared at them. Her knuckles were white. Then she said, "I should have known. That's not something I can put on Caleb. I should have known my own son was there." I didn't tell her it was okay. It wasn't okay. But I reached across and put my hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held on. We sat like that for a while. There are things that take a long time. My mother and I talked on the phone every Sunday for the following 4 months before she came to New York. Claire made dinner. Mom sat in our kitchen and looked at the life I'd built and said, almost to herself, "This is real. This is actually real." I told her yes. It's real. I built it. She met Claire properly. She saw the apartment and the porch with the morning light, and she met Hippo, who placed his enormous head in her lap immediately and looked at her with the completely unearned devotion that retrievers extend to all humans. She laughed. Genuinely, fully. I hadn't heard my mother laugh like that in years. She told me later that after Caleb told her the truth, she had gone to her room and read every piece of information she could find about me. Everything that was public. My firm's website. A profile piece a trade publication had done 2 years earlier. She read it 5 times. "I kept thinking," she said, "Gordon saw this. Gordon knew this was coming. And he didn't tell me." I told her about the night he'd said he should have been louder about what he saw. She cried then. Not the drowning kind of crying. The kind that comes from understanding something too late but still understanding it. She goes to a therapist now, in Millhaven. Has been for 8 months. She calls it the best hard thing I ever did. She sounds like herself again, just more honest. Caleb called me 2 months after the Saturday in Mom's kitchen. He told me he'd started seeing a counselor. That he was working on understanding where the compulsion to compete had come from and what it had cost him. I told him I was glad. He asked if we would ever be brothers in the real sense of the word. I told him the honest answer, which is that I don't know. I'm not going to manufacture a closeness that hasn't been earned just because we share a name. But I'm also not going to close the door. Some doors you keep open at a careful distance, not because you're waiting for something, but because you're watching to see if the person on the other side is doing the work. He said, "Fair enough. That might be the most honest exchange we've ever had." Reeves Hardware and Supply is stable now. All 3 original locations operating. 62 employees still showing up every morning. The sign on Main Street still says what it said in 1987. I don't have a role there. I don't want one. That's Caleb's to carry, and the weight of it, I think, is teaching him things he needed to learn. But last month, I drove up to Millhaven for a Saturday. Just a day trip. Claire came with me. We walked through the store. She'd never seen it before. She ran her hand along a display of hand tools and said, "Your dad built this." Not a question. Just recognizing something. I said yes. She said, "You're in all of this, even without your name on the door." I thought about that for the rest of the drive home. I'm sitting in my office in Brooklyn. It's early. The light is coming in the way it does in February, low and clean through the east window. Hippo is asleep under my desk. Claire left an hour ago for court. Coffee is still hot. On my desk, the yellow notepad. 3 words in my father's handwriting. You see clearly. On the shelf beside it, a new photo. Taken 8 weeks ago at my mother's house in Millhaven, the Sunday she made shortbread for the first time in years. My mother and I at her kitchen table. Her hands are wrapped around a cup. My hand is on the table beside hers, not touching, almost. The clock on the wall is still running 7 minutes fast. Some things take a long time to change. Some things you stop waiting to change and just decide to carry differently. I'm not the son who was erased. I'm not the brother who was outmaneuvered. I'm not the version of myself that Caleb described for 6 years in kitchens and church halls and funeral receptions. I'm the one who drove to Pittsburgh 43 times and kept the log because that's how I love. I'm the one who came back when 62 jobs were on the line, not because I'd forgiven everything, but because I'd built enough of myself to be able to separate what I owed my father's legacy from what I owed my own anger. That's not a revenge story. That's just what happens when you do the work, keep the records, and let the truth take as long as it needs. My father said it best. You see clearly. It just took everyone else a while to catch up.
If you like this story, do subscribe and like and do comment to let us know what type of stories you like to hear so that we can make up those. You can also share your own stories if you want them get uploaded along with your pick.